All right, so this is part 2 of the terminology chapter. So the last video we talked about the directional terms like superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, proximal, distal, stuff like that. And so now we are going to talk about sectional terms. So these are terms used to divide the body into different regions when we're studying them. And we'll see these different regions with like x-rays and CAT scans and stuff like that. We'll see the body divided into these different regions. Okay, so our first ones are going to be sagittal and mid-sagittal. So sagittal is going to divide the body into right and left. All right, and so mid-sagittal is just more precise, right? So you're dividing the body into exact right and left. Did not mean to do the highlighter. There we go. Exact right and left parts. Okay, so if we divide it right down the middle, that is mid-sagittal. Okay, but we could also have one here, all right? That would just be a sagittal section. So this would be, this would be sagittal compared to this being more pretty much mid-sagittal. Right, so if that was like right directly on the middle, right, the midline, that would be mid-sagittal. Okay, so sagittal divides into right and left parts. All right, and so then a frontal or a coronal section is going to divide the body into front and back. Okay, and so if we're looking at this picture, we wanted to do a coronal section, right? It would look like this. Okay, so we would be dividing the body into front and back. And then we have a transverse section, which would divide, or cross section, which would divide the body into top and bottom. All right, and so this is what you would see with like a CT scan or an MRI. You would see this transverse section. All right, so this would be an example of a transverse section. Okay, so that's transverse and that's coronal. Okay, all right, so those are sectional terms for sectional anatomy. A lot of the figures in your textbook will use these different sections, and so for example, when we're looking at the brain, it's really important to understand how that brain was divided to understand what structures you're looking at. Okay, so understanding what these terms mean is really going to be very important. All right, so now let's talk about the body cavities. Okay, so the body is divided into different major cavities. So we have two kind of major breakdowns. We have the dorsal cavity, right? So that, dorsal, we already talked about, would be closer to the back, all right? And then we have the ventral body cavity, which would be closer to the front. Okay, so the dorsal body cavity is primarily going to be all this green here, right? So that's all going to be dorsal. The dorsal body cavity can be divided into the cranial cavity, right? So we have the cranial cavity would be here. That would contain the brain. All right, you can kind of see that even just based on its shape. And then we have the spinal body cavity, which would go all the way down, and that would contain the spinal cord. Okay. And so with these different cavities, we're going to talk about the tissues that are found inside of those cavities. And so the tissues found in this dorsal body cavity, those are going to be called meninges. So the tissues that cover, these are kind of, by tissues I mean like covering tissues, right? So they're kind of protective tissues that cover. So the meninges cover the brain and the spinal cord. And they're found in the dorsal cavity. All right, so they're going to cover the brain and spinal cord. right? So you may have heard of meningitis, right? So meningitis would be inflammation of the meninges. So if you ever see in Anatomy and Physiology a word that ends in itis, that's going to mean inflammation. So usually it's inflammation of whatever the first part of that word is, right? So meningitis is inflammation of the meninges. Tendinitis would be inflammation of a tendon, all right? And so meningitis can be very dangerous because of actually the kind of structure of this dorsal cavity, okay? And the dorsal cavity is a little unique compared to the other ones we're going to talk about because this cranial cavity here, right, you probably know is completely surrounded by bone. It sits inside of the skull, okay? And so if you get meningitis, right, in this cranial cavity, meningitis, right, and inflammation typically produces a lot of fluid. And if you think about it, this bone, right, that skull is not going to, give, right, to the fluid, right? So what's going to happen is that fluid is then going to start pressing on the brain. And that is one of the major dangers with meningitis is as that fluid builds up and it puts pressure on the brain, that can cause a lot of, damage to the brain and its different functions. Okay, and that's simply because that dorsal cavity is located and completely surrounded by bone, which doesn't allow, for any movement as that pressure builds. Okay, so that's the dorsal cavity made up of the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. And then those organs inside of there are going to be surrounded by meninges. All right, so now let's talk about the ventral cavity. So the ventral cavity is divided into two other major cavities. All right, so we have our thoracic cavity, which is going to be up here. All right, and we have our abdominopelvic cavity down here. So these two, the thoracic, right, and the abdominopelvic cavity, are divided by the diaphragm. Okay, so here, we'll just kind of add this in here, would be where the diaphragm is located. And that is going to divide that thoracic cavity above from the abdominopelvic cavity below. All right, so let's talk about the thoracic cavity first. So within the thoracic cavity, we can divide that further into two additional cavities. All right, so the majority of the thoracic cavity is going to be taken up by the lungs here, right? So that's typically what we talk about when we talk about the thoracic cavity, is where those lungs are located. All right, and they're going to be surrounded by pleura. So if I were to point to where the pleura would be located, it would be essentially right there on the edge of that thoracic cavity. Okay? And then inside of that kind of thoracic cavity where the lungs are located, we have this mediastinum here. So the mediastinum is in the middle, right, in between those separate structures for the lungs. Okay, so this is the mediastinum. It contains the heart as well as the esophagus and the trachea and some major blood vessels that come off of the heart like the aorta, all located in that mediastinum. Okay, and then the tissue in the mediastinum that surrounds the heart is going to be the pericardium. Okay, so the pericardium would be there kind of sitting on top of the heart. All right, so this covers the heart. All right, and then this would cover the lungs. Okay. So while we're here, we're talking about these coverings, I want to introduce two more terms, and those terms are visceral and parietal. Okay, and so that relates to these coverings. So these coverings, when we're talking about pleura and pericardium, and in the abdominal pelvic cavity, the peritoneum, they can be either visceral, which means that that covering is sitting on top of the organ, directly on it. All right, so if we're talking about let's talk about, so the lungs, right? Since that's where this is, this term is, right? We're talking about the lungs. So if we had kind of the lungs were inside, I'll put them in kind of pink, right? So if the lungs are located inside of this cavity, right, that visceral pleura would sit directly on top of the lungs here, okay? So that's visceral. They sit directly on top of the lungs. And then parietal is going to be the pleura, or the tissue that lines the cavity wall. Whoops, there we go. All right, so come on. It lines the cavity wall. So then if I were to point that out on here, right, that would be, you would have parietal pleura all around the edges out here. Okay, so visceral pleura would be on top of the lungs. Parietal pleura would be on the edges of that thoracic cavity wall. All right, so visceral versus parietal, you can have visceral pleura, parietal pleura, you can have visceral and parietal pericardium, you can have visceral and parietal peritoneum. All right, so visceral means on top of the organ, parietal means lining the cavity wall. All right, okay, so that is our thoracic cavity. We have either the cavity for on the left and the right for the lungs, or we have the mediastinum in the middle, which contains the heart and some other important structures. Okay, so now let's talk about the abdominal pelvic cavity. We have the abdominal cavity, which is the one here in red, and then we have our pelvic cavity here in yellow. Okay, and so in the abdominal cavity, we have peritoneum. All right, so that's going to be the covering. We'll just put, it covers the visceral organs. All right, so that just simply means it's all of those organs in that abdominal cavity. So the stomach, the intestines, the liver, all of those organs within that abdominal cavity are going to be covered and surrounded by peritoneum. All right, and then lining the wall, right, of that abdominal cavity would be parietal peritoneum. Okay? All right, and so for each of these, you should know the names of these cavities and some examples of organs that are found there, in addition to these kind of covering tissues that are found in each of them. All right. Okay, and so then our last topic for this chapter is homeostasis. Okay, so this is actually an extremely important function for the body, and homeostasis just refers to the body's ability to maintain a set point value. All right, and so we're going to do some examples so this will make sense. All right, so but homeostasis is maintaining a set point value. So think of like your thermostat in your house. You're going to set it at, maybe 70 degrees, right? That's your set point value. If it gets too hot, right, the air conditioning will turn on to bring the temperature down. If it gets too cold, the heater might come on to bring it back up. Okay, so that's kind of an example in your home of homeostasis. But the body maintains homeostasis of many, many different things. Temperature is one of them. pH is another. Blood glucose, different waste products in the body, oxygen, carbon dioxide. A lot of different things are maintained within homeostasis because your body requires that specific range. Okay, and so homeostasis in the body is regulated by two different systems. So we have the endocrine system. Okay, and so the endocrine system works through hormones. right, you're going to learn all about the endocrine system and the different hormones in AMP2. Right now, you should just know that hormones are molecules that are released into the blood, and then they travel through the blood till they reach whatever their target is. Okay, and so typically the endocrine system will act more slowly. Right, so it responds more slowly than our other system, which is the nervous system. Okay, and so with the nervous system, it's going to be very fast, right? So it acts quickly. We're going to learn about this this semester. We have nervous system at the end of the semester. All right, so it's going to act through neurons. And they're going to send, for now we're just going to call them electrical impulses, which are very quick, right? Compared to a hormone which has to travel through the blood until it reaches a target, this electrical impulse can move very quickly directly to the target because you would have a neuron, right, that is talking to whatever that target is. Okay? All right, so homeostasis is maintained through negative feedback. Okay, and so what negative feedback is essentially, it's like that thermostat example we just talked about. All right, so it will restore, it always functions to restore a set value. All right, so negative feedback will always bring you back to a set value. So let's talk about temperature regulation as it relates to the body, not in your home. Okay, so with temperature regulation, if we have this scale here, all right, and so this is our normal kind of body temperature, 98.6 degrees. If you start getting too hot, all right, what does your body do to bring you back down to normal body temperature? Right, so if we're in Georgia, you go outside in the summer, it's really hot, what happens? Right, hopefully you realize you're going to start sweating. Okay, so that is what is going to restore, that is the negative feedback mechanism that is going to restore that temperature to the set point. All right, so sweating. Then what about if it gets too cold? So if you go out in the winter, where, you know, if it's a miracle it snowed in Georgia, right, and it's really, really cold, what happens? How does your body restore that body temperature? Okay, so hopefully you're thinking, right, shivering. You're going to start shivering. Okay, so shivering and sweating are both negative feedback mechanisms, right, and then this is controlled in this example by the nervous system. And so it happens very quickly. Okay, so this is an example of negative feedback controlled by the nervous system, so that's temperature regulation. And then we have blood sugar regulation, and so this comes from the endocrine system. So here we're going to be talking about hormones. All right. So we know blood sugar is generally very tightly regulated by different hormones. So if this is your kind of normal set point value for your blood sugar, let's say you eat, you know, some donuts for breakfast, so you have a lot of sugar in your blood. What, maybe you know, maybe you don't, right? What hormone is going to bring that high blood sugar back down? All right, so that hormone is called insulin. Okay, so insulin is going to bring your blood sugar down back to the set point. So that is a negative feedback mechanism for maintaining your blood sugar. Okay, so then if your blood sugar gets really low, maybe you haven't eaten in quite a few hours, all right, and you're getting really hungry, your blood sugar's low, the hormone that is going to help to bring your blood sugar back up is called glucagon. All right, and so it's going to go to that stored sources of glucose in your body and cause that stored glucose to be released. Okay, and so these are two hormones, right, that are going to regulate blood sugar. Okay, and so both of these are examples of negative feedback mechanisms. Okay, so you should be familiar, I would be familiar for your exam with both of these examples and kind of how they work in general. Okay, and so that's negative feedback. Negative feedback is always going to restore homeostasis, okay? So negative feedback will restore a set value or homeostasis, right? It brings you back to this kind of normal range for whatever it is we're talking about. Okay, so there's another type of feedback in the body called positive feedback. And so with positive feedback, it is not going to restore homeostasis, okay? So this is actually much less common type of feedback, although we'll talk about it a couple different times in the semester. All right, so with positive feedback, what's going to happen is you're going to get a signal, and positive feedback is basically going to amplify that signal and make it bigger and bigger and bigger. So the simplest example of this, all right, and remember that they're not very common because they don't restore homeostasis, all right, so there's only a couple examples of this positive feedback. So one example is labor and delivery, right? When a woman's giving birth to a child, we have a positive feedback mechanism. So what happens is the uterus contracts, all right? That causes the baby to press on the cervix. That pressure on the cervix from that uterine contraction causes a release of oxytocin, all right? That oxytocin, the job of oxytocin is to cause the uterus to contract more. All right, and so then we're going to release more oxytocin because that baby again is going to press on the cervix. All right, we get more contraction, we get more oxytocin, and then this is just going to keep going until that baby is actually fully delivered. Okay, so we are amplifying and prolonging that signal with positive feedback. All right, so that's labor and delivery is one example. Another example of positive feedback is blood clotting. All right, so when your blood clots, platelets are going to come and stick. All right, platelets stick, and then they release chemicals that attract other platelets then to also stick. Right, platelets stick and attract more platelets to stick. Okay, and so then that keeps building until you form like a nice stable clot, all right? But those are two examples of positive feedback. Again, not as common because they're not restoring homeostasis, okay? So this would move away from homeostasis. All right, we're definitely not bringing back to a set point. Okay. All right, so that is it for this chapter on terminology. Next chapter we'll be doing chemistry. Make sure you work on your homework for this chapter as well as filling in your chapter review to help you prepare for your test.